For Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, the most mundane tasks often come with enormous hardship. Life under Israeli occupation has become a labyrinth of checkpoints and permissions. Harassment and humiliation by Israeli soldiers and settlers is routine. Every Palestinian has a painful story to tell. American author Nathan Thrall has made one of those stories the subject of his latest book, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama. It follows a Palestinian man from the West Bank town of Anata near Jerusalem. Salama's town is almost encircled by Israel's separation wall. In 2012, when a school bus carrying his 5-year-old son crashes, Salama must navigate a maze of restrictions and bureaucracy to find out if his son is dead or alive. His Israeli-issued ID doesn't allow him to cross the military checkpoints that surround his community. And he doesn't have permission to enter Jerusalem, where his son could be in hospital. It's an excruciating journey to eventually discover that his son has died. Thrall's book about Salama's tragic but common experience has won a Pulitzer Prize. On this episode of the InnerView, I'll talk to Nathan Thrall about his book and the new insights he has gained about the occupation and the future of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And the author of A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, Nathan Thrall, joins us now on the InnerView. Nathan, good to have you on the program.
Pleasure to be with you.
You write beautifully, and it's an extraordinary story. First of all, congratulations on winning the Pulitzer. And
thank you.
We're going to talk a lot about the book and the backdrop that it's set against. But what was interesting is that the book came out a couple of days before October the 7th. And for many people, the region and the world changed after October the 7th. I wonder, had October the 7th happened before the book came out, would you have changed anything in the book?
You know, I really would not have. And that's one of the saddest things about our present reality, is that the system of ethnic domination of Israeli Jews over Palestinians that the book describes is one that has been in place for decades. It exists today during this war, and it's going to exist after this war. And if anything, all we're seeing after October 7th is that this system of domination in all its details in the West Bank is now being re-implemented in Gaza as it was prior to the Israeli withdrawal in 2005.
A lot of people focus on the booms and the bangs and the literal explosiveness of active war, whether in Gaza or when there are raids in the West Bank, when there are firefights. Did you feel that you wanted to actively explore the banal, the mundane, the kind of everyday nature of the occupation, even in what is called ceasefire time or peacetime?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question, because that was really a driving motive of the book. I wrote it at a time when I was extraordinarily frustrated with the way that the world would deal with Israel-Palestine, which is to pay attention, as it does now, as it should now, when we have a war, when we have tremendous bloodshed. And then when that happens, the world calls for calm and to restore calm. And as soon as the ceasefire is reached, everyone goes about their business and forgets about Israel-Palestine, tacitly accepting this reality of daily violence that Palestinians are subjected to that results in these recurring bouts of bloodshed. I wanted to draw our attention to the mundane, to the everyday, to this system that has existed for decades, and as long as it continues to exist, is going to result in more and more bloodshed.
You have a medley of characters and you weave them in beautifully in this tapestry. You have Abed's family tragedy. He loses his son. He has the panic of searching for his little boy when there's a terrible bus accident. At every level of analysis, from whether the bus accident could have been prevented to the aftermath of it, whether those lives could have been saved in time, to the reality of all these characters converging from the soldiers and even a settler and Palestinians with different color IDs and so on and so forth. An individual tragedy that tells you the story of the collective tragedy. When you were in the process of writing it, both in terms of the initial essay that you wrote and the book itself, what did you learn? You're not somebody who's uneducated about the region. What did you learn that you didn't know before?
The knowledge that I gained is exactly the kind of knowledge that I wanted to convey in the book. And that's a kind of knowledge in your bones, a knowledge in your gut, an emotional knowledge of how deeply this system of control reaches into the lives of every Palestinian and into the most intimate aspects of their lives, to the point where somebody like Abed chooses at one point a marriage partner based on the color of her ID just to be able to keep his job in Jerusalem. I mean, the decision of who to marry is part of this system of control that is affecting every Palestinian day in and day out. So for me, it was less about the kind of knowledge about the system, which I did understand, and more about its emotional toll, the depth of the pain that it causes, and how that pain is just below the surface for everyone who's living under it.
About a decade ago, a dear friend of mine lost his mother very suddenly. He was in the United States. His Palestinian ID was a Gaza one. He had Gaza on one of his documents. His mother passed away in Ramallah. He couldn't go back to his mom's funeral. And whether he would, I don't know, try to fly in or go through Jordan or whatever. And I guess it's that everyday grind. It's that everyday humiliation, even in not being able to go to your mom's funeral, or in the case of Abed, having a green ID, not having the blue ID of Jerusalem to be able to check the hospitals in Jerusalem to see if his boy was there. Talk to me a little bit about that sort of collective daily degradation and humiliation that Palestinians encounter every day, whether they are inside or outside the occupied territories.
Well, as you know, the key to this system of domination is the fragmentation of the Palestinian people, to divide them up into different categories, into different groups that have different levels of rights. And people in the Palestinian diaspora have the fewest. They're not even allowed to enter the occupied territories, the Palestinian refugees. And then the next level up, so to speak, are Gazans who are trapped, who have been trapped for many, many years inside Gaza and are not able to travel, with very few exceptions, to the West Bank to do something like attend a mother's funeral, to do something like go to school or receive medical treatment. Even today, when we think about Gaza, we have so many people there who are in need of medical treatment, who are in need of safe haven. By international law, the occupied territory is a single territory. It's disconnected, but it's one territory. When you read the UN statements on the occupied territory, it talks about one occupied Palestinian territory, not territories plural, but territory singular. And what that means is that you are entitled as an occupied person to travel within the occupied territory, but Israel prevents it. Israel's preventing Gazans today from going to the West Bank and receiving medical treatment as they're entitled to do. It's preventing West Bankers from going into Jerusalem. This fragmentation is essential to the lives of Palestinians whose families are torn apart, whose villages are torn apart, whose social fabric is torn apart very deliberately in order to weaken the Palestinian national movement, in order to prevent a Palestinian state from ever emerging.
Are we as far away as we can be from the possibility of a Palestinian state, or even some sort of, federal solution, one state, whatever it is, given what's happened from October the 7th onwards?
We were eons away prior to October 7th, and we're eons away today. The fundamental issue is that Israel has all the power. The Palestinians have very little, and Israel is pursuing its rational self-interest, which is to continue the status quo. It perceives either giving the Palestinians citizenship and equal rights or giving them a sovereign state on a mere 22% of their homeland as far more costly than merely perpetuating the status quo, telling the world the occupation is temporary, telling the world that they would like to one day end it, but it's really the Palestinians' fault that they're not ending the occupation, and meanwhile expanding Israeli Jewish settlements and constricting Palestinians into tighter and tighter enclaves like the one that Abed and the other characters in this book live in.
Let me try and get into the mindset a little bit now, and also maybe repeat some of the things that have been told to me by Israeli officials and others. So the response could be, or would be, it's unfortunate, it's a sad situation with Abed, but unfortunately for him, he's got terrible leadership, whether it's Hamas in Gaza or the PA in the West Bank, because this is unresolved, it's disputed territory. And while someone like you, Nathan, as a Jew, can make aliyah to Israel, which is a birthright of yours, Palestinians have citizenship in other countries. Like my friend, he has American citizenship. Why isn't he just happy with that? Why are they constantly fantasizing about this home and this hope of a homeland? They have other countries, Arab countries, to go to. And let me add a final string to this, is that Israel is under attack from not only Hamas in Gaza, but also from the north by Hezbollah. It's an island of democracy in a hostile region. So, with that kind of mindset, how easy or difficult is it to counter that narrative within Israeli society and among Jews around the world?
Within Israeli society, it is extraordinarily difficult to counter that narrative. That is a very widespread view. And although there are differences among Israelis, the overall subscription to this worldview that we are entirely just and that the world is out to get us and this is entirely, unfair, that is held by left and center and right. And the ability to change it really is only going to come about through accountability, through really changing the incentives for normal Israelis, making it difficult for them to travel, to no longer have visa-free travel to countries in the West, to suspend the EU-Israel Association Agreement, to no longer get carte blanche from the United States and billions in military funding. Those kinds of things would change the equation for Israelis. But in the absence of that, just having a different narrative, presenting them with facts isn't going to change anything. Regarding the Jews in the diaspora, it's a different story. They are much more open-minded, open to hearing a different argument, and we're seeing that there's change there. There's generational change there that will have an effect. It's a slow process, but it's an important one.
I want to get personal for a moment, and I only ask you because you addressed this in an interview with The Guardian. I'm not trying to be Dr. Phil here, but tell me about your relationship with your mother, who disagrees with the work that you're doing as a Jew.
For many years, my mother has found it impossible to read what I write. She says it's too painful. We can't talk about Israel-Palestine. We really can't talk about politics at all. She's a very political person. She loves to talk politics. So it's really harmed my relationship with her, my ability to just have normal conversations with her. We found a way around it. We have agreed essentially not to exacerbate the differences that exist and just to not talk about it. But this is my life. This is my professional work. And it's a really big part of her life and her identity as well. And I see it all around me. You know, my story is not unique. There are so many cases, particularly in the diaspora, of Jews whose relationships with one another have been severed, and that has really accelerated since October 7th.
And I appreciate you addressing that for me. How is Abed doing? The central character in your book, the launch pad for your story, the man whose personal tragedy was a vehicle to tell this bigger story. How is he doing right now?
He, like most Palestinians in the West Bank, is in a very unfortunate set of circumstances. The constriction on Palestinians, on their movement today, is as great as it has ever been in the more than half century of occupation. It now takes hours to travel distances that used to take a half hour. The number of jobs in the number one employment sector, which is Israeli jobs and jobs in Israeli settlements, those have shrunk to almost nothing since October 7th. So people are feeling economically constricted. The level of violence by the Israeli army and settlers is extraordinarily high. More than 500 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th, and that includes some of Abed's relatives, his very close relative of his wife, Haifa, who was just on his way to work in Ramallah and was killed because he happened to be next to a place where the Israeli army was trying to arrest someone. And you know, the way that this affects people is that they wind up being locked into their small communities. They don't leave. When I went and had an iftar dinner at Abed's home, I saw his brother, who lives in Ramallah and who used to visit his family with great frequency. And it was the first time, it had been 6 months, it was the first time that he had seen his family in 6 months, because he didn't want to travel on the roads. It was too dangerous. There was too much violence from settlers and the army. And so people feel trapped. They're locked in.
I had a conversation with Sliman Mansour at his studio in Ramallah. This was, I guess, late November last year. And it was interesting because he has an artist in his 70s, and he had two studios, one in East Jerusalem and one in Ramallah where he lived. And he told me, he said after October the 7th, even he as this, this old man, it was too dangerous for him to take that road, to take that sort of Jerusalem road with the checkpoints and the possibility of the settlers attacking and so on and so forth. And again, I sort of bring it back to this idea that, and I don't want to sound like a Hasbara bot here, but there were many Israelis who told me, a lot of the people in the kibbutz communities, they were leftists. They were people who were giving jobs to people from Gaza. They were open to them. This is the price we pay for being more open, for getting them to work in our communities and so on. And now after October the 7th, finished. No more. With that in mind, how scary might things get? So
what I would say is, first of all, the Israelis have had a very, very quiescent occupation from 1967 until 1987, with very little resistance. And they didn't give Palestinians freedom or a state during that time. Since the end of the Second Intifada, for the entirety of the term of the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, from 2005 until the present, he has given the Israelis extraordinary security cooperation that the Israelis themselves praise. They have had a quiet period in the West Bank with very little resistance, with a lot of cooperation from the Palestinian Authority. And have they relaxed life for Palestinians in the West Bank? Have settlements stopped? Do Palestinians in the West Bank have freedom? No, the opposite has occurred. They are constricted into smaller and smaller spaces. Israeli Jewish settlements are expanding, and there is no statehood or liberty or freedom on the horizon for Palestinians. So it's very convenient to keep people under occupation indefinitely. And then the moment where they raise their head, maybe after years, they raise their head and try and fight against their occupiers. You point to it and you say, aha, see, that's why we need to keep our boot on their neck. It's a convenient argument, but it doesn't actually reflect the reality, which is the Palestinian national movement itself has been reaching out to Israel since 1988, saying we're ready to make the biggest concession that any indigenous people has made. We're ready to say that 78% of our homeland is yours, and we want a mere 22%, a disconnected 22%, and even that they can't get.
You've just won a Pulitzer for this book. Do you feel that telling this story about this occupation, this conflict, is better done, better served by writing in this way rather than when you, say, for example, worked for the International Crisis Group?
Absolutely. You know, it was a major career decision that I made, which was based on my experience working for the International Crisis Group for a decade and talking to leading policymakers in the US and Europe, leading politicians, leading thinkers. And I would have these conversations with these people, some of whom serve in high levels in the US government today. And they would say to me, listen, I'm convinced by what you write in your reports for Crisis Group. I'm convinced by what you write in your articles. This is a deeply immoral system. We are supporting it. There is no prospect of this thing ending in the foreseeable future, in large part because we continue to support it. And yet, I myself, as this policymaker in the US government, I'm telling you, I will not lift a finger to change this policy. And the reason why is because the kind of change I could make is so tiny. And even for that tiny change, which you would laugh at, I could lose my job over it. And what I understood was that I was really wasting my time working for the International Crisis Group and talking to these people and trying to convince them. What I needed to do was to try and talk to ordinary people who are the constituents of these governments, and through their change in public opinion, through their visceral sense of how deeply immoral this system is, through their outrage at their own tax dollars going to support it, then we could create a different environment where those policymakers whom I used to speak with now feel they have the freedom to act on what they actually believe.
It sounds as if you believe that the dial has turned a little bit. You mentioned earlier there was something changing among Jews in the diaspora. So we've seen the student protests in the US. We've had people suggest that maybe Biden was dented by what has happened and his response, you know, people calling him Genocide Joe and so on. So the fact that these politicians and policymakers now feel as if there is a change among the constituents, what kind of phase are we in right now, especially within the US?
The way I look at it is we are on a decades-long road to eventual accountability for Israel, including withdrawal of military support and the withdrawal of political support in the form of UN vetoes, and all of the different ways that the international community is currently protecting and supporting Israel and its occupation. I believe that that is eventually going to be radically reduced, if not come to a full end. But that is a decades-long road. And so what we're at right now is at the very beginning of it. And the steps that are being taken are very important. They're opening a door. We see that the US, for example, has started to impose for the very first time sanctions on a small group of violent settlers and settler organizations. Every few weeks, that group is expanded with new sanctions. And so this is a process. It's a very long one. And what I worry about is that when this war in Gaza ends, this mobilization that we have today is going to disappear. And what we really need is political organization that will sustain this pressure, that will help to push for further steps in this direction toward accountability for Israel.
And all the more reason, the day the the ceasefire happens, all the more reason for people to understand what the status quo means by reading your book and understanding what it means, because it's not a picnic. It wasn't a picnic that led up to October the 7th. And do you feel galvanized by that telling that story would have those effects downstream, that people finally get it? They don't just see it as Hamas attacking and Israel responding.
Absolutely. That was really my dream with this book, was that the readers of it would come away with a sense in their gut of what it is to be in the shoes of a Palestinian under the system of control, and that was the most important thing for anyone to know. You don't need to know the details of Israeli-Palestinian history. You don't need to know the details of the checkpoint system and the methods of land confiscation. What you need to know is that there is a system of ethnic domination here by one group over another. The West is supporting it, and it needs to come to an end. And I've been really encouraged by the readers who have told me how their views have changed by reading this simple human story.
Nathan, you're a brilliant writer, and I'm really glad to have spoken to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the interview.
It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.